Shalom everyone, Yoel again from Hebrew in Israel, another video. This time I'm going to talk a little bit about Hebrew, because that's mostly what I do. For those who are interested, by the way, I do give Hebrew lessons, and based mostly Hebrew lessons on biblical Hebrew and lessons in Tanakh. That's one of my fields of expertise. And today I want to talk about something pretty simple, but still a little bit complex. Some people have asked me about the issue of correct pronunciation. There are quite a few different accents that exist in the Jewish world. The modern day accent used in Israel is mostly based on the North African pronunciation or the North African accent. Most Israelis speak with a North African accent. But we do know that there were different accents throughout the centuries, even dating back to the First Temple period. We have a few theories about how things were actually pronounced. And the main issue basically is that there are some consonants today which are not pronounced the same way they were pronounced in the past. Now, there are quite a few people who are attempting to reconstruct the correct pronunciation of these consonants and also reconstruct the correct pronunciation of words. And I've been doing research in this field of pronunciation for, wow, probably the majority of my life. And I have actually traveled around different Jewish communities to hear how they pronounce things and what they know about the original pronunciation. First of all, there are multiple different ways of pronouncing different letters, especially if you deal with the more ancient pronunciation. A few examples are, for example, the argument over vav and waw. Okay, if it's a v sound or a w sound. Now, if it's a v sound, then how come do you have a bet that does not have a dagesh? How come it's pronounced as a v as well? One of the rules is that you do not have the double sound for a consonant. Basically, when I say double sound, is that if you have two sounds and you have the same possible pronunciation between two letters, it has to be that one of these double sounds does not exist. In other words, if bet is also a bet and a vet, how come vav is also pronounced as a v? So a lot of different communities had a pronunciation of a wa, even communities in Europe. As far as I know, there is a letter from Frankfurt from the 1600s that actually talks about the pronunciation, for example, of a certain of gimel, for example, that they had two pronunciations. One is a g and the other one is a r. Okay, so there's this question: how come do we have double sounds? Or in other words, how come do we have the same sound for two different consonants? And the answer is probably because these consonants did not have those sounds originally. For example, bet, vet versus vav and waw, because this is a classic example. It's actually a bit simpler to explain because there are other sounds which are a bit more difficult to understand because they're not used in everyday Hebrew. But the idea is that, and this is based on a theory, by the way, by Dr. Tol Sinai, is that the existence of dagesh lene, which is this little dot which appears inside a bet, kaf, pei, tav, is actually something that was introduced in the Second Temple period under Aramaic influence, which means that bet was really pronounced just as a b. So the question is, did vav have two sounds, or did vav have only one sound and the other sound did not exist? That's a good question. We don't really know the answer. Another example is, and this is something even more elaborate, is, for example, the pronunciation of chet versus kaf without a dagesh is pronounced as a ch. If we take Dr. Tol Sinai's theory and we say, okay, there is no dagesh lene, there was no such thing, therefore there is no double sound of a chaf, ka and ch, what do you do with the second ch sound? Okay, because the pronunciation today is that chet is pronounced as a ch, but older pronunciation pronounces a h, deeper in the throat. And then you have the double kaf. However, if there's no dagesh, then the secondary ch sound can be moved to a different place, or not. Here specifically, we actually do know that there was a double type of a chet. There was a chet 1 and a chet 2. Okay, it works that you basically divide up based on looking at Semitic languages and seeing how they connect to one another and what developed from what. Hebrew, for example, is not different, and Hebrew developed two types of a chet like other languages. So it seems to be that there was a chet 1, which was pronounced as a ch, or maybe that was the chet 2, depends, doesn't really matter what the numbering is. You had one chet which is pronounced as a ch, another chet that was pronounced as a h. Now these are actually also, by the way, considered to be two different consonants, which, for those of you who are very interested in the issue of roots of words, this can actually create two very distinct roots from one another. These are not really the same letter, which means that in many situations, words that share similar roots are not necessarily actually from the same root. They actually might come from a different root. So for example, the idea of father roots and son roots is probably, based on this piece of information, is probably incorrect, because you can sometimes have similar consonants, but they have nothing to do with one another. They're actually two completely distinct words. In any case, these are, for example, just two examples, but you have a whole slew of different consonants. So for example, different people today go to Yemenites or Persians or Iraqi Jews or North African Jews, and they try to figure out what exactly is the accent they use, and they imitate that. A very popular one is, for example, using the Iraqi pronunciation, which people think is the original. You have to remember also that Iraqi Babylonian Jews were in Babylonia and never really left Babylonia. They never really left Iraq. Okay, which is there are a lot of things that you can spin off of that as well. For example, what is the real genetic makeup of Jews, or what is the real genetic makeup of Israelites? What was the race of Israelites? I'm not going to go into that, but you can do your own calculations. And at any rate, that pronunciation, for example, is very, very popular. However, based on what we know of comparative Semitic studies, that pronunciation is a stage inside the Hebrew language. Okay? And we know that there were other stages. What exactly they sounded like, we don't know. For example, another thing that comes up as well is the issue of how to correctly pronounce a word when you have a vowel consonant, also known as aleph, hey, vav, and yud. They also have some Latin term which I can't stand, because comparing Hebrew to European languages is ridiculous, because there are similar things and there are a lot of different things. It's not really necessarily smart to do that. But in any case, do you pronounce, for example, the name Yehuda as Yehuda or Yahuda? Do you pronounce the vav or you don't pronounce the vav? The answer is, we don't exactly know. However, Hebrew is a phonetic language, which means that if what you see is what you pronounce. But we do know that there are different ways of spelling words. So it means that though you have a vav there, there's also the possibility of not spelling it with a vav, which means the pronunciation will not have a W sound or a V sound in it. In other words, the issue of going to an original pronunciation is not that simple and is not that cut and clean. And it's healthy to study these things, but to make a whole I would say a whole Torah out of it, a whole study out of it, a whole method of theology, almost theology, is a little bit ridiculous. Okay? Is it good to go back to original pronunciation? The answer is yes. The question is, what is the original pronunciation? Okay, so, if you want to pronounce one thing or another, or one thing this way or that way, it's your decision. It doesn't really matter. As long as we understand what you're saying, that's the important thing. Also, by the way, just another very, very important point is that we do know as a fact from ostracons and writings which were discovered from the First Temple period that there were different accents or different ways of pronouncing words, or actual entire complete different dictionaries between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, for example. So how do you really define an original accent? You go to countries where there are regions and people speak in different dialects in these regions. Well, they're speaking the same basic language, but they pronounce things differently from one another. So the answer is it probably isn't an original pronunciation, and each tribe or each group of people had their own pronunciation. However, it's a fun thing to research, and I encourage it as well, and there are plenty of videos out there that talk about correct pronunciation, and they're very interesting, but it's important to understand on a linguistic point of view, sorry about that, you have to understand that historically speaking, there isn't an original pronunciation. There were multiple pronunciations. Okay, so I hope this sheds a little light on this subject. Again, to explain everything means to explain everything in the subject means you have to take an entire course in linguistics, or at least some basic courses in linguistics, especially in the field of semantics. And I hope that this is informative for everyone. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email at Hebrew in Israel, one word, at gmail.com. And I will do my best to answer these questions. Again, I'm a one-man operation, and I do everything by myself, so you have to sometimes be a little patient, because I'm also married, children, everything. So if you send an email, I will see it, and I will answer it the moment I can. Thank you very much.